I've pressed live. Hey folks, we're just testing our settings here behind the scenes. We'll be right with you. All right, well, I guess we'll get started here. Hello, everybody sitting on YouTube right now. Welcome to our first nature talk of 2021. That mystery voice that you're hearing behind that scene of a wetland is me, Becky Parker. I am the coordinator at Nature Nova Scotia. And I am going to introduce you to my friend Emma Bocking. I can switch our scenes here. Here's Emma. Hi, Emma. And we're going to talk to you guys about wetlands today. So, if you're new to Nature Nova Scotia, if you're new to Ducks Unlimited, we can both tell you a bit about our own organizations. Nature Nova Scotia is the network of natural history societies and other environmental groups in Nova Scotia, and we represent the natural history community in Nova Scotia, the Naturalists. So we're really keen on wetlands as a policy, and are really excited to learn some more about them, particularly the ones that we have locally. So Emma, if you want to go ahead and take it away with your wetland knowledge, go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Becky. This is funny. I don't know that I've given a webinar from my couch yet this year. I have given a lot of meetings and workshops, but not quite this. So this will be interesting. Yeah, so I guess Becky suggested I just start by talking about the wetland here behind me. This is one of my favorite wetlands in Halifax, Marsh Lake in the Sandy Lake. Near the Sandy Lake Regional Park. So it's not quite a marsh and not quite a lake, at least in the part that we were visiting that day, but a beautiful site that I would definitely recommend checking out if you're in the area. So I do have a bit of a presentation that I'd like to share with you guys. So let me just share my screen. All right, so Becky, people can see that? Wonderful. All right, so the title of our talk today is Wetlands and You, and today is World Wetlands Day, not to be overshadowed by Groundhog Day. I thought of that pun earlier. Oh, good one. But today marks the anniversary of the signing of the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. And there are a number of Ramsar wetlands across Canada, and those are recognized as internationally significant spaces. So I think there are, you can correct me if you know this, but maybe 3 to 5 Ramsar wetlands in Nova Scotia. I always remembered when I used to work in Newfoundland, I remembered there was only one Ramsar site in Newfoundland and Labrador, the Codroy Valley. So I could always remember how many Ramsar sites are in Newfoundland, but sometimes I forget here in Nova Scotia. But if you are nearby, you should definitely check out those sites, and you can go on the Ramsar Wetland Convention website and find a map of where Ramsar sites are across the world as well as in Canada. So a little bit about me and my life and history in wetlands. So I first fell in love with wetlands after my undergrad degree. I did a degree in environmental studies, at the University of Waterloo in Ontario. And after graduation, I worked as a field technician in northern Alberta in the oil sands region of Fort McMurray, working on a project around peatland restoration and peatland function, looking at hydrology and ecology as well. So here we are in a very wet, treed fen, measuring water table height in early spring, it looks like. So after working as a field technician for a couple months, I started my own master's research looking at the impacts of a road and other linear developments on the vegetation and tree growth in a poor fen, which was looking at one specific site, but there are many such linear features and forestry roads and roads and pipelines and those kinds of things throughout northern Canada. So we're looking at how those linear features can really, even though they don't have such a big individual footprint, they can really block the hydrology and the water flow across these wetland systems. So I like to say that I was looking at very small things like tiny tree rings and sphagnum mosses to better understand these larger landscape scale questions. And actually what we found, I was remembering this the other day, because I maybe we'll talk about roads across wetlands later, but the main problem was that the road that was built in the 70s had just one really small culvert that was blocking this, that was providing for the water flow for this entire wetland. And soon after the road was built, we found out by looking at the tree rings and various other things that a beaver actually blocked that one culvert. And so a few years after the road was built, we could see that all of the trees started to die. So it was more that interplay between that ecology and those kind of man-made alterations that really changed the wetland there. And lots of beavers around this part of the world as well, of course. So after finishing that schoolwork, I started working with Ducks Unlimited in Newfoundland and Labrador. So first on the west coast of the island there, and this picture is from the Lark Harbor area, just west of Corner Brook. Did lots of neat wetland mapping and assessment work. And then 2.5 years ago, we opened our office here in Halifax, and still get out occasionally to take people to cool wetlands. This one is called, or we call it Eisner Cove Wetland. It's a kind of a poor fen swamp complex in Dartmouth, and it's actually almost 80 acres of relatively undisturbed wetland in a fairly dense urban residential area. So it's a very neat spot. And I also get out to do quite a lot of wetland surveys in the summertime. So me and Becky were saying earlier, these pictures kind of give the impression that I get to do cool outdoor things all the time, but in reality, like most biologists and people in conservation, 80% of the year I'm inside working on a computer, writing emails, asking for money, and other things like that, which are equally as important, though maybe not as fun. So as Becky mentioned, I work for Ducks Unlimited. So this is our mission. So we conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and grasslands to benefit waterfowl, wildlife, and people. So we've been around in Canada since 1938. Originally was created based on a concern for a decline in duck populations during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s and associated wetland loss, and also the increase in agriculture that also led to that wetland loss. So the biologists started to put together the fact that habitat loss is really what was the driving factor behind wildlife loss. So our first restoration projects were called duck factories. So duck factory number 1 was built in Manitoba near Winnipeg in 1937. And for the first 50 or so years of Ducks Limited, all of our projects had a line in the documents where you had to justify the expense for the project that was an equation of how many breeding pairs of waterfowl you would get per acre of investment. So it very much had that kind of traditional waterfowl heritage focus and focus on producing duck numbers. But as we'll see later in this presentation, and as I'm sure all of you know, wetlands have many, many other values as well in terms of cleaning water and storing carbon and controlling floods and biodiversity for all sorts of animals. So they're very important systems. I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted on that one. But we do often, I often get a lot of questions about our waterfowl heritage and how that influences how we do conservation. And I've put a lot of personal thought into this. And I always refer back to this paper that looks at the relative conservation impacts of people who birdwatch, people who hunt, and people who both birdwatch and hunt. And they actually found in this particular research paper that people who do both of those activities have the largest conservation impact. And in terms of money donated, time spent outside, time spent volunteering for conservation organizations and things like that. So what in my own personal experience, I know a lot of very ethical waterfowl hunters, and unfortunately there's a lot of hunters that do maybe give it a bad name, but I found that I birdwatch and I have waterfowl hunted before, and both experiences connected me closer to nature and particularly wetlands, and also to the people that I was doing those activities with. So this on the left is bird watching with friends at Rainbow Haven after Hurricane Dorian. We had just seen an American avocet fly over, so we were all smiles. And like the skimmers were there that day, and the laughing gulls and etc. It was a cool day. And then on the right, that was from when I harvested my first duck. It was a mallard from a wetland project that we had restored in the Tantramar Marshes borderland area, Missaquash area between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. So very connected to birds and wildlife and nature and people in both of those situations. So for many years, we've taken this continental approach to wildlife conservation, and that just recognizing that because ducks are migratory species, you have to protect their whole migratory route in order to really provide that wildlife, that full habitat population protection. So in 1989, in recognition of this continental approach, the United States passed the North American Wetlands Conservation Act, and this allows for money to be spent and to be funneled from American state governments to Canadian governments, and in some cases to Mexico as well for that continental approach, in order to protect wetlands, to protect waterfowl and other migratory birds. So that is administered by joint ventures, and there are many joint ventures in North America. We are part of the Eastern Habitat Joint Venture, which is a partnership of many organizations. And I think the neat thing about this approach is that it really draws attention to the fact that every acre matters. Every pond, every bog in your backyard is being counted as part of this whole continental scale approach. So when you lose one wetland, it is impacting the whole. And when you gain or protect one wetland, it's also making a big difference. And that approach has been extremely successful for waterfowl. So 1989 is when we see the passing of this Wetland Conservation Act, and that's really a turning point of when you start to see this increase in waterfowl populations. And today they're still the healthiest guild of birds. And there's a lot we can learn about this habitat protection and protecting the entire migratory route that would benefit a lot of these other bird species that are struggling. And I should mention too, those joint ventures, as of a few years ago, they're not just waterfowl focused anymore, even though that was their original intent. They have an all bird approach. So they're looking at how wetlands and associated habitats can really protect all of these bird types, especially recognizing that now that waterfowl populations are so healthy, how can we use that science and that knowledge to help these aerial insectivores and these grassland birds and these shorebirds that really need our help right now. So we know that wetlands are important for waterfowl, but also are extremely important habitats for other birds like willets. So salt marshes are key habitats for willets and other shorebirds, especially on their migratory pathways. Songbirds are shrub swamps are important habitats for songbirds. And that's because if you've ever been in the middle of a shrub swamp, as I was to take these pictures, you'll know that they have a very high horizontal complexity, and that provides a lot of safe little nooks and crannies for these small birds. So I remember this past summer, I was in the middle of an alder swamp in Lower Sackville, and like a catbird was suddenly just next to my head, feeling very safe, I suppose. But all of these interlocking shrub branches provide a lot of safe nesting and feeding habitat for songbirds. And this paper talks about how the aquatic invertebrates that are found in marshes, like dragonfly larvae, caddisfly larvae, they have a higher fatty content that is really valuable for tree swallow growth. So this picture is from Belcher's Marsh in West Halifax. So tree swallows, again, one of those aerial insectivores that are one of our most at-risk groups of birds. So what is a wetland? Now, maybe I should have said this earlier, but I guess put very simply, a wetland is just land that is wet during at least part of the year. And the official Canadian national definition is listed here at the top, but kind of some of the key components there are poorly drained soils, water-loving vegetation, and biological activity adapted to a wet environment. So bacteria that can decompose matter in waterlogged or anaerobic conditions. So in Canada, we have 5 main wetland types, divided here by the soil type, so mineral soil and organic soil or peat. So the first is shallow open water, and that's any pond, mostly less than 2 meters deep. Marshes, so we have salt marshes and freshwater marshes. Swamps, so these are treed wetlands. And then our 2 peatlands, which are my favorite types of wetlands. We have fens, which receive some of their water from groundwater and surface water. And we have bogs, which are ombragenous, which means all of their water comes from precipitation, fog, or snowmelt. So that means they tend to be more dry than fens, have less open water, and also are more nutrient poor and acidic. So you get all sorts of cool plant adaptations and things like that. So sometimes I get people telling me that there are no wetlands in Halifax. I guess sometimes when people think of Halifax, they think of the city and concrete, I guess. And while it's true that there are no wetlands on the peninsula, the Halifax region itself, as you know, is a huge area. It's a huge county, but many of these pictures are actually taken quite close to the urban center. So what I've loved about working here is really getting out and experiencing the diversity of wetland types that you can find relatively easily. And most of these pictures were taken from a trail and were very easy to get to. So the top left there is a pond on the Mount St. Vincent University campus. Middle top is a mainland common in the mainland common park in Clayton Park, just south of Halifax West High School. Chesapeake Salt Marsh is, I think, maybe Becky's favorite wetland in the world. And that's along the eastern shore. That's a vernal pool in Herring Cove. Next to that, engineering school on John Brackett. No, sorry, that's somewhere else. Near that national park place. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay. It's on Herring Cove Road. Or the other side of Herring Cove Road. Anyway, vernal pool. That's Russell Lake in Dartmouth, which has a really nice boardwalk, and Macintosh Run in Spryfield, which has a really amazing trail network there's a component that is basically a wilderness trail / mountain bike route in the Herring Cove area. And then also there's a section that's a larger, flatter, more publicly accessible walking trail where this picture was taken. So a couple other things I like about wetlands. I'm definitely more of a plant person than a wildlife person. And one of the things that really draws me into wetlands is just how difficult they are, not just for plants, but also for people, and just how they are not easy to walk through, and you can get your feet wet if you're not dressed properly. You can fight through some pretty tough alder, but they really reward that careful look. And one of the ways they really reward that is with these wild plants that in some cases you'll find in no other environments on Earth. And wetlands, and especially these are all examples of peatlands, peatland plants, they are such extreme environments. They can be cold and also sometimes hot and wet, but also sometimes completely dry and often very acidic. So how do you even survive as a plant in these wildly fluctuating at times conditions? So we have carnivorous plants that get extra nutrients from insects like pitcher plants and sundews. We have lichen that can dry out completely to the point where you can flake it into a flower between your fingers and then it completely rehydrates itself when it rains. And we have black spruce that sends up these little rootlets that can get oxygen from the air when the soil is waterlogged. Labrador tea and other ericaceous plants actually have adaptations on their leaves similar to some kinds of succulents where that prevents evapotranspiration and water loss from the tops of their leaves during dry periods. And a plant like cranberry where their seeds can float so that they can travel along through the wetland during the snow melt in the spring when they get released from the plant. So some really, really cool things going on in wetlands, especially on the botany side. So I just wanted to talk even more about trees for a second. One of the most fascinating things that I've ever studied in my life has been the tree rings of black spruce in bogs. And many of you probably know how you can, through the science of dendrochronology, use the relative widths of tree rings to understand the climate and landscape of the tree, of where the tree was growing throughout its life. And people use that to age buildings and violins and figure out climate change and all that. But you can also do that in wetlands to understand, to kind of recreate loosely wet and dry periods. So as long as you understand that a tree will grow more in conditions that are favorable to it, then you can kind of extrapolate from there that a tree would grow more in a wetland, probably when the wetland is more dry. So when you get these narrow years, you might interpret that those were years of high water in the wetland. So this is how we kind of started to figure out in that wetland I was talking about at the beginning that I was studying for my master's, when the road was built based on when the trees started to die and when the rings started to get narrow and when the beaver came in and blocked the culvert. But you could use that principle to understand a lot of different wetlands. I haven't done that yet, but every time I'm in a wetland, I wish I had like an increment borer or a chainsaw to get some more tree samples. Maybe that'll be my next summer project. Yeah. Anyways, I digress. The last cool plant I wanted to talk about in more details is sphagnum moss, which is kind of the building block of peatlands. So that organic soil or that peat is primarily made of sphagnum and slowly decomposing sphagnum. So this is a really interesting plant because it's non-vascular, so it doesn't have roots like all moss, and so it relies completely on each other to survive. So on the left there, you can see that the top ground cover with all the densely packed sphagnum, and then in the middle is like a cross section of a sphagnum hummock, or that kind of lump of sphagnum that you'll see in bogs and some poor fens. And they're so tightly packed together, and it allows it to actually, instead of having roots, to draw water from the base, from the bottom, up to the top of the ground surface, or the top of the sphagnum. And this is especially important during dry periods because although it's a wetland, sometimes, especially in a bog, if it's relying completely on rain during dry periods, it still needs to get water from the base as opposed to from the top through rain. And this process is called capillary rise. So that's when you get, so if you imagine a drinking straw, when you get the water in the middle of the straw is like this. Is that called the meniscus, Becky? No. Yes. Okay. Thank you. So the water is like starting to go up the sides of it. So when the water's in a closed packed space, it will start to rise up that tightly packed space. And that's the same is true between tightly packed stems of sphagnum moss. And another reason why it's so cool is that each individual sphagnum plant can hold up to 25 times its own weight in water. So it can really hold on to water during wet periods and times of flooding and slowly release it during dry periods. And this is especially important if we think about why we want wetlands in cities or near our houses, because they are excellent at storing water and controlling floods. And on a day like today, where there's just water everywhere here in Halifax and snow that is melting and slush, and the drains can't drain it all, and there's no wetlands, and all the grass is packed down and frozen, it really reminds you of how hard and impermeable a lot of our cities are, and how important a system like a wetland is to really soak up that extra water. So that kind of brings me to why we should be protecting these wetlands. And good job on past me for having sphagnum in the background of this picture. Not planned, but that was a good transition. In Nova Scotia, we're relatively lucky to have a wetland conservation policy that's been around for 10 years now, or will be 10 years in the fall. And the goal of this policy is to prevent the net loss of wetland in Nova Scotia. So it is allowed to, our people are allowed to develop on wetlands but they have to submit a permit, and it goes through a mitigation sequence. So first they must prove that they cannot avoid adverse effects. Then they have to try to minimize those effects. And then lastly, they have to compensate for the wetland loss at a 2-to-1 ratio. So 2 hectares of wetlands have to be restored for every hectare that is lost. So there are some, like any government policy, there are pros and limitations to this. So a pro is that cost of compensating for that wetland loss does discourage some developments in wetlands. Another pro is that loss that does occur is compensated at a 2-to-1 ratio. And there's a thing called wetlands of special significance built into the policy that protects certain wetlands. So for example, all salt marshes are protected under this policy. Wetlands with certain species at risk, wetlands owned in protected areas, in drinking water supply areas, and things like this. Unfortunately, although we have gotten better at the science of restoration, these new restored wetlands are never going to be as effective as natural wetlands at delivering these functions. Another limitation is that compensation is not always delivered close to where the wetlands are lost, because it's not always easy to find those restoration opportunities. And that's my last point. I have to move my picture. Offsetting exchanges certain environmental loss for potential future environmental gain. So when you're offsetting, you're definitely losing this wetland, and you are hoping that your new wetland is good and works, and doesn't always. So that's a limitation. So I always try to get people to care more about these policies because they really impact your watershed and the landscape where you live. So why should you care about this wetland policy? It determines where wetlands are located. Some wetlands cannot be restored. It's hard and it's expensive to restore peatlands, for example, compared to marshes and swamps. And it's a no net loss on a provincial scale, not a watershed scale. So I mentioned before that it's not easy to find restoration opportunities everywhere. And that's especially true in a place like Halifax, where once a wetland is lost, it's usually lost because there's now a house on it or a shopping mall. So you're not going to be able to restore that. So in your watershed, if a wetland is lost, you might be losing that wetland function locally to you, even if we're able to compensate for that loss in Cumberland County or Antigonish or somewhere like that. So one of the things that we're focusing on here in Halifax is the importance of wetlands in urban environments. So we already talked about this. They're important for flood control, carbon storage, biodiversity, recreation, all these things. But we are losing a lot of them in our urban areas. So for this map, I just subtracted the wetlands that no longer existed since the creation of the provincial wetland inventory about 20 years ago. And we were able to map out which secondary watersheds had the highest percentage of wetland cover lost in the last several years, and the colored, the different colors represent the current percentage of wetland cover. So the research indicates that in order to achieve adequate wetland function, it's good to have at least 4 to 5% of wetland cover. So you can see that a lot of our watersheds, especially close to where a lot of development is occurring or has already occurred, fall in some cases well short of that percent wetland cover to achieve healthy functionality. So one of the ways that we're researching how wetlands function in Halifax is by using this tool called the Wetland Ecosystem Services Protocol. And this is a rapid tool where you can go out into the field for a couple hours and do some hours of office work and get a sense and start to get a sense of how wetlands work and how that individual wetland is functioning based on 18 different ecosystem services or functions. So the red dots represent a wetland that we visited this past summer to do that assessment. So I won't go really into detail in this, but one of the functions that this tool assesses is the ability of the wetland to store carbon. So one thing that quickly becomes apparent is that some wetlands just naturally function better in some areas than others based on their wetland type. So carbon storage is a great example of that, where we can see here that the bogs tend to have the highest carbon storage scores. So those two bogs in Mainland Common Park, Purcell's Cove Backlands, Eastern Passage, they had high carbon storage scores. But we can start to use this data to get a sense of which wetlands in Halifax are most important for storing carbon or storing water or for shorebird habitat or fish habitat or sediment retention or water cleaning or any of the 18 functions that this tool assesses. So we're excited to see how we can really use this data. So I'm pretty sure this slide is redundant for anyone here, but I guess the thing I want to most underline is how important it is to go out and enjoy public natural spaces. And I'm sure you're all familiar with that idea, but the more that people are seen in these places, especially wetlands, especially to me, wetlands, the more awkward it would be if they were lost. I guess it's often the places that often get lost are the places that kind of fall through the cracks, and we often don't realize that they might be a threat until the excavator's there, and then it's often too late at that point. So go out and enjoy your favorite spaces, tell people about them, celebrate them, take pictures, make sure that that helps keep them safe. Okay, so that's it for that part of it.
Great. Thank you so much for the backgrounder. That was a lot of really good info. I wonder if maybe we could talk some more about policy, which could be a little bit drier. Give folks a chance to stick their questions into our chat here. If you have any, you can just type them right in there. And we can get policy stuff out of the way, and then we can move into like other cool wetland topics. So I know, our current wetland policy from 2010, as you said, is about 10 years old. Well, 11 now, I guess. Oh my gosh, it's 2021. And it's gone through a couple changes since it was first created. So in 2010, that was, I think, the first time that our wetland policy stated, a goal of no net loss. And as you explained, there are wetlands of special significance, and there are ways that we can lose kinds of wetlands as long as we're compensating for them. It was also amended in 2019 on a couple things, but there are still some gaps there that are maybe due for updating at some point. I'd be surprised if there aren't some provincial staff already looking into this. But I wonder what you think about things like, approval not needed to amend certain wetlands, and if that's an area where we could make some improvements in the next couple years. Like right now, we don't need an approval for things like certain types of roads, and we don't need approval to alter wetlands that are smaller than, 100 square meters in total area, which would of course make some really small wetlands like our vernal pools, it could put them at risk. And then layered on top of all of that, we have a provincial inventory, which is not entirely accurate because it's very difficult to know where all the wetlands are. So yeah, I guess where do you see some room for improvement around just policy pieces?
Yeah, I guess the first step that I really see is the need to update the provincial wetland inventory and the data that we have around wetlands. The policy was created in 2011, but the inventory goes back to aerial imagery analysis from before that, from I think more the mid 2000s. So it's especially in areas that has seen a lot of development. It can be fairly out of date, and a lot of wetlands that appear on the inventory no longer exist. And also, we just have much better mapping technology now to pick up a lot more wetlands on the landscape. So I've seen some small examples of people have used LiDAR to test out wetland mapping functionality in small watersheds, and they overlay it with the existing wetland inventory, and it's like two completely different maps. Like it picks up on smaller wetlands, it picks up more easily forested wetlands, and it's another, like the most interesting part is that it is better at picking up connectivity between existing mapped wetlands. So what looks like isolated pockets on the inventory are actually part of larger complexes. And if we know that, then that would definitely influence land use planning decisions, because what looks like 3 scattered wetlands is actually part of a much more complex mosaic. And when you start to kind of cut apart those complexes is when you get those flooding conditions and flooded basements and problems and things like that. So having that better data, and certainly having a better idea of where forested wetlands are and having those mapped would be, I think, a huge benefit to a lot of people. And I think you also spoke to the importance of trying to have better protection for smaller wetlands. There's a lot more science now, I think, around the importance for vernal pools, for wildlife habitat and biodiversity, but also the importance of small wetlands in biogeochemical cycles, in carbon storage, and all these things, and especially in urban environments where there might be a lot more of these smaller fragmented wetlands that are maybe the only wetlands nearby. So even though they're small, they still need that protection. So maybe if there was able to be more of a watershed scale focus, so looking at not necessarily a no net loss on a provincial scale, but on a smaller, more localized scale. So maybe there are watersheds where we shouldn't lose any more wetlands because there's only 1% of the land covered that's wetlands, and there's only 3 wetlands left. So maybe we should protect those, for example. And I only learned this recently, but although currently wetlands of special significance do include those with species at risk, they're only for stationary species at risk, so plants. But if like a Blanding's turtle uses a wetland, or like a Canada warbler, it doesn't necessarily count all the time. So I think they're trying to figure out ways to change that. But I think that would be an important step as well.
Yeah, and you spoke to the importance too of being, active in your local environment, in your neighborhood, and noticing what's going on around you in these wetlands. So being able to identify a wetland when you're in it is definitely a great place to start. If you're new to these ecosystems, they're squishy. That's probably the easiest way to describe them. But yeah, the average person probably isn't going to know the difference between, say, a bog, a fen, a salt marsh, a marsh riparian area, floodplain. Yeah, so that's definitely one thing that we could do as naturalists, is just get better at recognizing the kinds of wetlands we're in, so we can help update the information that's out there. and watersheds. I feel like you and I have both worked in Ontario, and awareness of what watershed you're in, I think is something that's relatively new to Nova Scotia, or maybe non-existent in most of Nova Scotia. Um, in Ontario, where we have our conservation authorities who operate on a watershed-based jurisdiction, we have policy and planning decisions that get made on a watershed level, and then we also have like permitting processes that get made at that level. Um, when it comes to wetlands here right now, as you mentioned, we have the potential to be losing a potentially significant, or not provincially significant, but an important wetland in our own watershed, and then maybe gaining some of those benefits in the future in another one. So that's something to be aware of too as a naturalist, that if you're noticing some development, yeah, ask those questions, maybe wonder where those benefits are going. I don't know if you mentioned this, as maybe I was checking our stream feed here, but it was the GPI Atlantic report that estimated we had already lost $2 billion, or we're losing $2 billion annually because of lost ecosystem goods and services from lost wetlands. So it's a lot. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, and I don't know if I've read that specific report, but certainly we found that putting that dollar value on wetlands and other habitats is a valuable tool in gaining people's attention, especially politicians and other types of decision makers. And I know I sometimes I feel strange about that, or I did it first as a biologist and as a naturalist, and I but having understanding those ecosystem services and the economic value of them can be a really good tool in the toolbox in terms of promoting wetlands and their importance for sure.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, for folks who are interested in learning about wetland policy, it is available on the province's website. It's actually also really easy to find. You can Google your way to it. And it's one of, I think, Nova Scotia's more readable policies out there. It's actually not a bad read. So check that out if you're interested, and we can move on from policy. There's a couple other questions in our chat here. Let me see if I can group them by theme. I definitely want to talk about bogs. They're my favorite wetland. I know that your favorite wetlands are peatlands as well. So Katie has a question about carbon storage, which could tie really nicely into a bog discussion. She's wondering how the carbon storage function is assessed using WESP.
Yeah, that's a good question. So how the tool works is you input, it asks a series of questions for the field part and the office part, relating to the vegetation and surrounding land use and hydrology. And in this Excel file, it calculates scores for the different functions based on those answers that you input. So for the carbon storage, it's relating. So for each of those functions, it takes into account maybe 20 to 30 of those questions and weights them differently. So for carbon storage, it's roughly based, the most important factors are the depth, the soil type, so whether it's mineral or organic soil. So organic soil has more carbon. The depth of that soil, so deeper soil has, the deeper the peat, the more carbon is stored generally. And also whether there's an outflow, so an outflow of water. So when water flows out of the wetland freely without obstruction, less carbon is stored because more is exported by that water course to downstream systems. So in a bog, generally there's no open water and there's less loss of surface water. So more of that organic matter is stored and has a chance to be sequestered in the peat soil. And we didn't really get into this, but there's those 18 functions, and it's not really a simple case of like, okay, what is the let's add all those function scores together and get like these super wetlands that are the most important and have the highest scores. And this is a good example of how some functions naturally work against each other. So where a wetland has a high carbon sequestration, which is great, it will have a low organic nutrient export score because it's holding on to more of its organic nutrients. Whereas a wetland with a high, it's also important in your watershed to have wetlands with high organic export, nutrient export, because that feeds a lot of downstream ecosystems as well. So another reason why the diversity of wetland types is really important on the landscape. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and we can probably share some more info after the chat if folks are interested in learning more about how existing carbon is assessed in peat or in wetlands in general, because there's some interesting science that goes into that as well. I guess talking about bogs in general, I mean, we're both really keen on bog plants. I wonder if you have any fun bog stories or bog plant stories. I know that Ducks Unlimited has a new, or not that new actually now, Treasured Wetlands program, which features a really cool bog in southwest Nova Scotia. So maybe you know about some interesting places people could visit.
Yeah, so through our Treasured Wetlands program, one of our sites is Swains Bog, close to in Shelburne County, I think. I always get Shelburne and Barrington County mixed up, but it is one of 2 or 3 wetlands in Nova Scotia that has this one plant called thread-leaved sundew, which is a sundew that has like a really long leaf on it with the little sundew dots. It's cool. Actually, Becky and I went there together a couple of years ago. So that's definitely a neat spot. In terms of accessibility, I would definitely, if you're in the Halifax area, recommend checking out the Mainland Common Bog. There's 2 in that Mainland Common Park. One has a trail leading up to it, which is fairly accessible, and the other one has a boardwalk right up to it, which is very easy to get to. And those are cool areas. Bog stories. I don't know. I think some of my favorite bogs were in Newfoundland, on the island of Newfoundland, and just the scale of those huge blanket bogs was just incredible. They just would stretch to the horizon. And if you've ever been to that province, it's just like the landscape there is big, and there's just so much space, wilderness. So those big, wide open bog spaces are pretty special.
I do love a good bog. If you haven't explored a bog near you, I mean, Em and I, I'm sure, both definitely recommend it. They don't look like places where you might want to go walking, but they are my favorite wetlands to wade through. If you're lucky, you could get them on a relatively dry day, and your feet will stay mostly dry. But most of the time, they are going to be squishy. Something that I really like to do with some of our youth groups at the Young Naturalist Club is go out and start digging around in peat. There's always something weird sticking out of the peat, which is a really fun activity if you have kids, or if you're a nerdy adult. I have found some really cool, very clean skulls and other bones just kind of like half buried in peat um, because they're acidic and wet almost all of the year, if not all of the year. You get really slow, nice decomposition in there. So you find really weird, like bird skulls and other little weird trinkets in there. Really cool place to go see rare plants, like Emma mentioned. And to learn more about that Treasure Wetlands program, we'll post a link to that as well. But that's also a really great way to explore not just bogs, but a bunch of other wetlands in Nova Scotia. Wendy actually has a question here about the Treasure Wetlands program. She's wondering any ideas about the treasured wetlands for 2021? Where are they going to be located?
Yes, I know where they all are going to be.
You can't know yet.
It's a surprise. But I will say that one of them may or may not be related to the wetland behind me. So if you remember anything I said about that, that's a hint. Actually, one of our 4 wetlands this year is going to be based on a community vote, which we opened today on our Treasured Wetlands Facebook and Instagram pages. And where it's going to be a vote between Miners Marsh in Kentville and Brookfield Marsh near Brookfield. So we're getting people to vote on which of those 2 wetlands they would like to see as our 4th treasured wetland site.
That'd be an interesting competition. Those are both really well-loved wetlands. I may have already voted today. Yeah,
you can vote again tomorrow too, don't worry.
Oh, you get a vote a day?
Sure.
Oh,
yeah,
wow. Okay. That'll be even more interesting because there are people, I'm sure, who feel strongly enough about both Miners Marsh and Brookfield Marshes to vote multiple times. So that'll be neat.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe getting back to bogs here and ecosystem goods and services, carbon storage. I wonder, so within the city there, within the HRM, when you're looking at these different benefits, are there any wetlands? I know that you've rightly said, it's not a competition between wetlands, and we can't just say, okay, this is the wetland with the most scores, so these are the ones that are most important. But are there wetlands that stand out to you that could be good candidates for either protection or management, or that people should just know about because of a particular benefit?
Yeah. So basically, our next big step, now that we've assessed these 40 wetlands so far and plan to go out again this summer and look at some more around Halifax, is to figure out how we can prioritize those wetlands, recognizing that we, in a growing city like this, we can't protect every wetland on the landscape. How do we make sure that the most important wetlands are identified and protected? And there are examples of how to do this from around Canada in terms of habitat prioritization. We haven't completed that framework here yet, but basically, I'd like it to have a watershed scale approach. I think that's really important. So making sure that we're protecting a diversity of wetland types in every secondary watershed, so that we can capture all of those different wetland functions. And I think we're trying to work really closely with the city as well to make sure that their own priorities are captured. So in terms of recreational value and water storage for flooding and carbon storage to meet their Halifax climate change action plan goals. So there's a lot that, one of the amazing things about wetlands is that they provide all of these ecosystem services. So they check a lot of boxes for a lot of different interest groups. So how can we, I don't know yet. I guess it's a short answer, but how can we make sure that we plan to protect the most important ones for, while we still can? To be determined.
Well, it's important work that you're doing.
World Wetlands Day 2023.
I wonder where the concept of a watershed or knowing which watershed you're in is not something that's super common in Nova Scotia. Do you happen to have a watershed map available that you could just pull up? I could Google one, but I know that I won't find secondary watersheds. Or maybe we could describe secondary watersheds to folks.
Yeah, one of my slides had, here, I can share my screen again. Yeah, so this map here, these black lines are the secondary watersheds. So the basic definition of a watershed is that every drop of water that falls in it will drain to the same place. So depending on the topography, you could get many or fewer watersheds, and there's different scales. So there's continental scale watersheds and then more local scale. So this big one up here is the Shubenacadie. This one here is the Musquodoboit watershed. And then there's many smaller ones closer to the coast where all the water would just drain directly into the ocean. This is the McIntosh Run watershed. This is the bottom half of the Sackville River watershed here. So yeah, definitely find out what watershed you live in. You could probably Nova Scotia watershed map.
Yeah, I'll try and find a map that would let folks maybe across the province kind of zoom in and see which watershed they might be located in or get a general idea of where water might be flowing in the area that you live in, because that's definitely important to know about. All right, so what are the questions we've got here? Sarah's wondering if we have any advice about or for exploring our local wetlands without disturbing them too much, which is a really great question, and maybe depends on the type of wetland that we're in. I'll let you go first. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sarah. Definitely within parks, there are wetlands with really great boardwalk. So I would definitely start there. In one thing we used to do to also avoid sinking too far into especially really squishy bogs and fens is to wear snowshoes during the summer, and that kind of spreads your weight around so you don't get too many stuck feet, but that can be a bit awkward. I mean, in marshes, you could probably just go right in chest waders, and it would be more you that would be uncomfortable than the wetland, I would say. Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, if there is a trail and a boardwalk, it's probably good to stick to that. There's often, if there isn't, there's often some kind of animal trail you could stick to. I guess it depends how many people are accessing the wetland. If it's a relatively undisturbed remote site, then you could just try to avoid more sensitive plants like orchids or pitcher plants to avoid crushing too many special specimens like that, I'd say. But I also don't want to discourage people from tromping right on in and paying attention as much as you can to not disturb too much, but it is a special pleasure, definitely, just to go right into these systems for sure. What do you think, Becky?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I want to get people right out into the wetlands so you can really experience it. I think that's how we can protect them better, is by really giving people those experiences. So yes, I want to encourage you to go out there. I guess I would say generally, if you follow leave no trace principles, I mean, if you're not aware of them already, you can Google them. It's all good advice, and they do give um, some situational advice where, if you have a larger group, then it might make more sense to spread out in the environment that you're in versus sticking all to one trail. If it's just you or a few of you, or depending on the environment you're in, maybe it makes sense to stick to that the deer trail or whatever it is that you're following. And yeah, like you said, stick to a boardwalk if that's an option. I feel like the best wetlands to explore are usually the ones that don't have boardwalks because they don't get as much visitation. They're really neat. But yeah, I like the snowshoe thing too. Probably most people haven't thought about wearing their snowshoes in the summertime, but yeah, that is a great way to spread out your weight. Note of caution in bogs in particular, because I have fallen into many a bog hole. Do watch where you're stepping. So if you're going walking through squishy areas, watch for those kind of squishier or wetter looking areas, bogs are really interesting in that they are essentially floating mats of peat in the center. And you can go right through if you're not careful, which is how I've lost many rain boots in my career. Um, yeah, that's a really good question. Another thing is, and this is the trickier part, is to maybe just be aware of the species and the ecosystem functions around you, which requires a little bit more experience that you're only going to get by getting out there. And maybe I would finish my thoughts off with saying, especially if you're in southwestern Nova Scotia, just be very careful where you're stepping. Because there's a lot of like tiny, unusual plants in particular down there that I think you could really easily miss. Um, but yeah, if you're already a naturalist, you're in the naturalist community, odds are you're walking slowly through these ecosystems like we do, looking for things. So continue to do that, go slow, enjoy it, watch where you step, and yeah, leave stuff where you find it, I guess. Good question.
Yeah.
Another question here from Ron. He's wondering, because today the province announced some new or expanded protected areas. Are you aware of any particularly important wetlands, maybe wetlands of special significance that are included in those new areas? I'm not.
That's a good question. I actually just was looking at that list 2 hours ago for the first time. So there are many sites I didn't recognize, but the one that I did recognize I'm really excited about is the Upper Sackville Rivers area. And I know that folks with Sackville Rivers Association have been working hard for years to get that area more protection. So really thrilled to see that included on the list. And there's a lot of uh, good wetland habitat and riparian area habitat and habitat for Atlantic salmon and other important species in that area. And of course, it's only going to become more under threat from development pressures in the future. So to see that more urban area on the list is just so critical and so good to see.
Yeah, it's definitely important to be seeing more protection in these urban spaces where we know wetland conservation is a tool that we have in our, not just our carbon storage toolbox, but for mitigating damage from flooding, which is especially a problem in that area of the city, and wildlife habitat and all of these other things that are getting harder and harder to secure in the city. So, yeah, that's great. Yeah. Another question. We have a lot of questions. A question about invasive species. Do you see a problem with invasive species in wetlands in Nova Scotia besides purple loosestrife in channels? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So purple loosestrife is I've seen in a couple areas. There's one lake in Dartmouth where there's yellow floating heart, and for some reason it hasn't spread to other places. There's a couple areas in Annapolis Royal, I think, and also around Halifax where you can get the invasive Phragmites. I mean, yeah, coming from Ontario where aquatic invasive species are such a devastating problem. So Phragmites have taken over so many wetlands, especially along the shores of the Great Lakes, and they completely alter hydrology and take away habitat. Animals like carp just destroying ecosystems. We definitely don't have those problems here yet, but they can really take root very quickly, and then they're almost impossible to eradicate once they have really established themselves. So I would say that I haven't really seen many problem areas yet, but with climate change and it's not we're not that far away from geographically from places that do have more of a problem. It's probably only a matter of time before we see more of these species coming in. So it's managing them now in those small pockets. This is like the small window of time probably where we can actually manage them by removal before it probably gets too late. Grim, but we're lucky. We've been lucky so far, I think, to not have too many problems in terms of wetland invasive species. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we should definitely have a nature talk just devoted to invasive species because it's such a huge, important topic. But yeah, I think my outlook is similar in that we've been really lucky in Nova Scotia to be buffered by many things that have either kept new introductions out or repeat introductions out, which is sometimes what species need to get established. And a relatively small population and a relatively clustered urban population too, which would also prevent some of those local ecosystem takeovers when you get a new species introduction. I'm also I'm maybe too optimistic, I think, as a plant person, though, where there seems to be some differences in how, at least in Nova Scotia right now, invasive plants are progressing in aquatic ecosystems compared with some fish, for example. So yeah, so carp, huge problem in Ontario. Luckily, one that we fingers crossed. I could be wrong. Maybe an aquatic person will tune in and correct me, but I don't know if we have a carp problem anywhere in Nova Scotia right now. We do have problems with other invasive fish, of course, with bass and with chain pickerel, which will use wetlands. Yeah, in the plant world, and just because this, we had a question about purple loosestrife in particular. Purple loosestrife seems to be kind of a funny one in Nova Scotia, just anecdotally from my own observations, and that when I do see it, and I don't see it very often, I don't see it in the gigantic patches that I've seen it in other places in Ontario and where I know they're dealing with it out west. So yeah, so I'd love to see some more work done on purple loosestrife in particular, and maybe that's something we could talk more about in another talk. But yeah, cautiously optimistic about invasive species right now in wetlands, but nervous about the future, especially where our population is growing so quickly, especially within Halifax. And if we don't have other planning tools in place before that, then invasive species are something that kind of get layered on top of other environmental problems. They show up when you have other issues, I guess. So, so yeah. So hopefully, with the work that you're doing, I mean, that's just another tool that will protect us from future invasions. So. Ron, who's actually one of our board members and a member of Halifax Field Naturalists, has just mentioned in our chat, thank you, Ron, I should mention this, that there is a talk coming up from the Halifax Field Naturalists that is focused on invasive species. And I believe it's Invasive Species Council in Nova Scotia, Ron, who are going to be talking about invasive species in general. So I will post a link to that as well in our Facebook event. Ron, actually, if you have a link, feel free to paste it in the chat there too. But yeah, that'd be a great place to learn more about invasive species, terrestrial and aquatic. Let's move through a few more questions before we run out of time here. Eisner's Cove. June is wondering, the Eisner's Cove that you mentioned, is it near the harbor or Eisner's Marsh up behind InnovaCorp near Gaston Road Trailer Park?
Yes, the latter.
Okay.
So it's it's a bit confusing because there's also I should maybe just change what I call it, but there's also an Eisner's Cove that is actually a cove. And I don't remember now why I call it Eisner's Cove Wetland. It probably just confuses people, but it is the one you can access off Fenwick Drive behind the InnovaCorp Research Drive Research Park.
A lot of Eisners in Nova Scotia.
Apparently.
All right. Well, I guess maybe before we wrap up here, we could talk a little bit about wetland stewardship. So, as you mentioned, and you showed one of those really great figures from the Status of Canadian Birds report, waterfowl are doing so much better than so many other birds in Canada, in Nova Scotia as well. And a big part of that is habitat-based conservation, looking at an entire ecosystem and planning accordingly. So I'm wondering what you think, the natural history community or other conservation groups or the general public could do to take that method and apply it to other bird species that we really care about. There are some that for sure are going to be that will benefit from wetland conservation, but our shorebirds, for example, on average, are not doing as well. So how do we take lessons learned in wetland stewardship and apply them to other species?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a tough one. I mean, I think certainly the idea of that continental scale approach and those partnerships is really important. And I would say another good example of that is with monarch butterflies and that whole story around they're trying to protect their wintering habitat as well as their summer habitat. And it's certainly true for shorebirds as well. A lot of them are experiencing population declines because their wintering habitat is prime beachfront housing in South Carolina, and their breeding habitat is prime beachfront housing in Atlantic Canada. So it's or dog walking areas or whatever. So it's it's hard when birds' prime habitat overlaps with our own ideal places to live. But I think trying to promote that idea of that continental approach and recognizing the importance of protecting not just their breeding habitat, also their wintering habitat, and also everything in between. So all of their stopover routes. And if you lose one piece of that puzzle, then you can lose parts of the entire population. So there's, I guess, a benefit of having that waterfowling and that hunting heritage associated with duck and waterfowl population is that it really there's a whole additional funding mechanism that goes into their protection through this waterfowl heritage stamp fund, or I know that's not the exact name of it, but every time a hunter purchases a hunting license for a duck, part of that money goes directly towards wetland conservation through Wildlife Habitat Canada in Canada. And in the United States, every time someone purchases not just a hunting license, but also guns or ammunition, part of there's a tax collected that goes towards something called the Pittman-Robertson Fund, and that goes directly into wetland conservation in the United States, but also in Canada as well. Like part of there's projects in Atlantic Canada that are supported by funding from that tax on those recreational hunting items. So it's hard there's a lot you can do in terms of getting people to care, but also having money to do these projects is really important, because sometimes you just have to buy the land to protect it as a land trust, and you just have to have the money to do those restoration projects. So that funding mechanism through the waterfowl conservation stamp, through the Pittman-Robertson Fund and tax on those things has really, I think, helped drive a lot of these wetland conservation projects and made them possible across the continent. So I know that in recent years, there's been a push for anyone to buy a waterfowl stamp. So you don't have to do it to hunt. You can just, if you care about birds, you can just buy a waterfowl stamp every year from Environment Canada. And part of that money goes to Wildlife Habitat Canada and supports those programs. So that's something you can do. And then you get a cool stamp and information in the mail. So it's a win-win. And it's only like 15 or 10 or $15 or something like that. But yeah, definitely having those dedicated funds has been pretty critical, and that is based off of just generations of this heritage of people caring about these populations. So yeah, how do you just have to start building that personal connection and that charisma of shorebirds and aerial insectivores and all these other bird types, and for us that's obvious and that's easy, but yeah, building them with a wider piece of society and building in those funding mechanisms definitely takes time. But you can see that with in the agricultural community too, in some cases, for in Ontario, like bobolinks or other grassland birds, and trying to work with dairy farmers or cattle ranchers to protect those kinds of habitats as well. So definitely the importance of partnerships and collaboration across industries and people who you wouldn't necessarily think would be on board. But yeah, the more partners, the better usually for wildlife conservation.
Yeah, there's definitely an important reciprocal relationship between our hunters and other folks who live really close to the land and these animals, these ecosystems that they depend on them. So something that we could probably learn from in the natural history world too, I think. There's a lot of like keen birders in our natural history circles. But yeah, not the same kind of like giant community of folks who care about this particular group of species, or yeah, so cool lessons there, I think, to take away from the waterfowl world. All right, well, I guess our end lesson there, maybe key takeaway, is know your ecosystems, get out there and explore them, find your community of people who are also interested in them, learn more about them together, and then act to protect them. Yeah.
Yeah, easy.
Yeah, it's simple, right? What are they paying us for? All right. Well, we can end it there. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching tonight and listening to Emma and I talk about wetlands, which is something we both are really, really excited about. And thank you for asking so many great questions. I will go back to our Facebook event and our main Nova Scotia, Nature Nova Scotia Facebook page, and I'll share all that information that I promised. So, how to find out more about treasured wetlands in Nova Scotia and how you can access those cool spaces. More information about Emma's work, what she's doing, particularly around the HRM. More information about how you can find out what watershed you're in and what that might mean for your local environment. And what else did I promise? A link to the Halifax Field Naturalists invasive species presentation. Was there anything else?
I think that's it.
I hope not. That's all I've written down. All right. All right. And thank you, Emma, so much for chatting about wetlands.
Oh, my pleasure. This is just another Tuesday night for us. We just would have this conversation by ourselves anyways, probably. So
That's true. We talk about wetlands a lot. All right, folks. Another thing you could do for us to help this Nature Talk series keep going is let us know what other kinds of subjects you want to hear about. So next month we are talking about moose with our president at Nature Nova Scotia, Bob Bancroft. We're going to have an in-depth look at the natural history of moose as a species and talk about some current conservation concerns for them. But after that, our schedule is still open. So Emma and I are going to be talking about some potential other Nova Scotia-wide topics or just, yeah, current issues that folks might want to hear about. But if you have ideas, yeah, send them our way. You can send me an email. I'll stick that in our update as well, or message us on our Facebook page. All right. Have a great night, everybody. See you later.
bye. Thanks.